Hi, I tell very exciting and horrifying stories to everyone. I suggest you subscribe because I post such stories every day. The Whispering Artifact. Mark Lawson had always considered himself a skeptic. As an archaeologist, his work was grounded in facts, science, and history. Myths were just stories, tools ancient civilizations used to explain the unexplainable. But when he first saw the idol, unearthed from the dense jungle of South America, his skepticism began to waver. The artifact was no ordinary relic. It was unlike anything he had ever encountered. The idol was small, roughly the size of a hand, carved from a dark, glassy stone that seemed to shimmer faintly even in the dim light of the excavation tent. Its surface was etched with intricate symbols that defied interpretation. Most curious of all was the face, if it could be called a face. The carving featured hollow eyes and a mouth twisted in an eternal scream, a sight that sent an instinctive chill down Mark's spine. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" said Dr. Elena Ramirez, his colleague and closest friend on the expedition. She stood beside him, her eyes wide with fascination. "It feels alive." Mark gave a dry laugh, trying to shake the unease. Alive or cursed? But even as he joked, he couldn't tear his eyes away from the idol. It called to him in a way he couldn't describe, an almost magnetic pull. For a moment, the world around him seemed to fade, replaced by the sound of distant whispers. He blinked, and the sensation was gone. That night, Mark couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the idol, its hollow eyes staring back at him. He tossed and turned until finally he gave in to the compulsion. Slipping out of his tent, he returned to the excavation site. The jungle was eerily silent, the usual symphony of insects and animals replaced by a heavy stillness. The idol was still there, resting on a makeshift pedestal in the center of the tent. Mark reached out, his hand trembling slightly as his fingers brushed the cool, smooth surface of the stone. The moment he touched it, the whispers returned, louder now, urgent and incomprehensible. Images flooded his mind. Fire and ash, towering figures cloaked in shadow, and endless, screaming faces. He pulled his hand back, gasping for air. The whispers ceased instantly, leaving him in suffocating silence. Heart pounding, Mark stumbled back to his tent, convincing himself it was just exhaustion playing tricks on his mind. But the idol wasn't done with him. The next morning, the whispers began again, faint and distant, like the hum of a far-off crowd. Mark tried to ignore them, throwing himself into his work cataloging artifacts and analyzing pottery fragments. But the idol demanded his attention. Every time he passed the tent, the whispers grew louder. When he finally succumbed and returned to it, they stopped as if satisfied. Things began to escalate when he noticed the dreams. Each night, Mark dreamed of the same desolate landscape, a barren wasteland under a blood-red sky. Black spires rose from the ground like jagged teeth, and in the distance, a monstrous figure loomed. Its form was vague, cloaked in darkness, but its eyes burned like embers, watching him. Every dream ended the same way, the figure whispering his name. The more Mark interacted with the idol, the more his life began to change. It started subtly. Problems he had wrestled with for months suddenly unraveled themselves. He could read and interpret ancient texts with ease, even languages he had no prior knowledge of. During a presentation to the funding board, he gave such a compelling argument for further financing that the normally stingy investors immediately doubled their contributions. But the whispers were always there, growing louder with each success. Mark tried to rationalize it. Perhaps the idol was triggering some dormant part of his brain, enhancing his intelligence or creativity. But deep down, he knew there was more to it. The idol wasn't just helping him, it was using him. The first time something truly horrifying happened, Mark was in his apartment back in the city. He had brought the idol with him, unable to leave it behind. He was working late, poring over research notes, when he heard a voice, clear, distinct, and inhuman. "Write it down." Mark froze, his pen hovering over the paper. "What?" he whispered. "Write it down." The voice repeated, low and guttural. Without realizing it, Mark's hand began to move, scribbling symbols and phrases he didn't recognize. The words poured out of him in a frenzy, his wrist cramping from the speed. When it was over, he stared at the paper in horror. The symbols matched the ones on the idol. He tried to destroy the page, but the ink wouldn't smear, the paper wouldn't tear. That night, he heard the voice again, not just whispering, but laughing, a cruel, mocking sound that echoed in his skull. The next day, he noticed strange changes around him. Shadows moved when they shouldn't, stretching and curling toward the idol like eager hands. Objects in his apartment shifted positions when he wasn't looking. And the whispers, they were everywhere now, filling every corner of his mind. Mark's breakthrough came when he finally researched the idol's origin. After weeks of combing through ancient texts and obscure archives, he found a reference to an artifact known as the Voice of Malrok. It was said to be a vessel for a powerful demon, created by a long-forgotten cult. The idol granted knowledge and power, but at a cost. Each use brought Malrok closer to crossing into the human world. The realization sent Mark spiraling into paranoia. He tried to abandon the idol, locking it in a safe and throwing the key into a river. But the next morning, it was back on his desk, pristine and waiting. Desperate, he sought out Elena, confessing everything. "We have to destroy it," she said, her voice trembling. Mark agreed, but destroying the idol proved impossible. Fire wouldn't scorch it. Acid wouldn't corrode it. Even smashing it with a sledgehammer left no mark. Each attempt only seemed to anger whatever was inside it. That night, Mark dreamed of the wasteland again, but this time, the dark figure spoke clearly. "Set me free." The final straw came when Elena disappeared. She had taken the idol without telling Mark, hoping to find a way to contain it. When he went to her apartment, it was empty. The only thing left was the idol, sitting in the middle of the room, surrounded by deep gouges in the floor, as if something had clawed its way into the world. Mark knew he was running out of time. The idol wanted him to complete the ritual, to bring Malrok fully into this world. But he refused to give in. With no other options, he resolved to end it the only way he could, by sacrificing himself. The last anyone saw of Mark, he was boarding a small boat, the idol wrapped tightly in a burlap sack. He disappeared into the ocean, never to be seen again. Weeks later, a fisherman pulled up an unusual object in his net. A dark, glassy idol with hollow eyes and a screaming mouth. The whispers began anew. The forgotten carnival. The woods were silent, unnaturally so, as if the forest itself held its breath in anticipation. Claire and her 3 friends, Max, Lily, and Eric, stumbled upon the clearing like wanderers crossing into another dimension. The carnival loomed before them, its dazzling lights and music spilling into the darkness. It was as if someone had taken a fragment of a dream and dropped it into the real world. The Ferris wheel turned slowly, its carriages glowing with a spectral luminescence. Tents striped in crimson and gold fluttered in a non-existent breeze, and a carousel spun in perfect mechanical harmony, though no one was riding it. The air smelled sweet, like cotton candy and caramel, but the sweetness felt cloying, almost suffocating. Standing at the entrance was the ringleader, dressed in a deep crimson coat. His face seemed carved from wax, every feature too perfect and yet unnervingly wrong. His grin stretched impossibly wide, and his eyes gleamed like molten gold. He tipped his tall hat as the group approached. "Welcome, welcome," he said, his voice deep and melodic. "We've been expecting you." The words should have felt absurd, but instead they sent a shiver down Claire's spine. "Is this some kind of pop-up event?" Max asked, forcing a casual tone. "An exclusive experience," the ringleader said. "Your presence makes it complete." He extended his gloved hand, and in his palm were 4 shimmering gold tickets, each stamped with their names. Claire took hers hesitantly. The ticket felt warm, almost alive, pulsing faintly in her hand. She glanced at her friends. Eric was already grinning, eager to explore. Lily looked nervous, clutching her ticket as though it might bite. Max raised an eyebrow, but followed the group as they stepped through the gate. The carnival exploded to life around them. The music grew louder, the lights brighter, and performers emerged as if conjured from thin air. Acrobats twisted and turned high above, their bodies moving like ribbons in the wind. Clowns with painted smiles danced and juggled, their eyes glinting with something that felt predatory. It was beautiful, mesmerizing even, but Claire couldn't shake the feeling that the ground beneath her feet was waiting to swallow her whole. The group wandered deeper into the carnival, drawn by the various attractions. Each tent beckoned with promises of wonder and delight. Claire was the first to break off from the group. The Hall of Mirrors called to her with its shimmering facade. Inside, the world fractured into endless reflections. At first, it was almost fun. Her image stretched and distorted in ways that made her laugh nervously. But as she moved further, the reflections began to change. In one mirror, she saw herself aged, her hair gray and her face lined with sorrow. In another, she was a child again, standing alone in an empty room. Then, she came upon a mirror that didn't reflect her at all. Instead, it showed a figure that wasn't her, a version of herself with hollow eyes and a cruel smile. She backed away, bumping into another mirror. The room seemed to shift around her, the paths between the glass narrowing. The air grew colder, and the laughing reflection in the mirror tilted its head, as if mocking her fear. Meanwhile, Max wandered into the shooting gallery. The targets were familiar faces, people he knew from school, from work, even his family. At first, he thought it was a clever trick, a psychological game. But as he aimed the rifle and pulled the trigger, the sensation was too real. The targets shattered in bursts of red mist, and each time, he felt a surge of guilt mixed with exhilaration. "What is this?" he muttered, but the carnival worker running the game simply smiled. The more he played, the harder it became to stop. The faces became more vivid, the sounds of their screams faint but unmistakable. His hands shook as he fired again and again, until the final target wasn't a face he recognized. It was his own. Lily found herself drawn to the carousel. The horses were impossibly beautiful, their glassy eyes glittering like diamonds. As she mounted one, the world around her blurred, and she found herself riding through scenes from her past. She saw herself as a child, sitting alone in a darkened room, waiting for her parents to come home. She saw an argument with her best friend in high school, the word she could never take back. Each scene was sharper and more painful than the last, the carousel spinning faster and faster until it became a whirl of regret and despair. Eric, ever the thrill-seeker, climbed aboard the Ferris wheel. Each time the carriage stopped at the top, the view below changed. At first, it was the carnival as it appeared, a vibrant, bustling fairground. But with each stop, the scenes grew darker. He saw the clowns dragging lifeless bodies into the tents, their smiles stretching wider as blood stained their costumes. He saw the performers backstage, their bodies contorting into unnatural shapes as they prepared for their acts. On the final stop, he saw his friends, but they weren't the people he knew. They were performers now, their faces painted, their eyes empty. When the group finally reunited, they were pale and shaken, their experiences too strange and personal to share. But the carnival wasn't done with them. The ringleader appeared once more, applauding slowly. "You've all been such wonderful participants," he said. "But every show must have its finale." As he spoke, the carnival seemed to come alive in a new, terrifying way. The tents loomed larger, their colors bleeding into the night sky. The performers closed in, their painted smiles now cruel and predatory. Claire realized too late what the tickets truly meant. They weren't just for admission, they were contracts. One by one, the group was separated again, each drawn into their own nightmare. Claire found herself back in the Hall of Mirrors, but now there was no escape. Her reflection stepped out of the glass, replacing her as she was pulled into the mirrored world. Max faced the targets he had shot, now fully formed and vengeful, their hollow eyes glaring as they surrounded him. Lily's carousel stopped spinning, leaving her trapped in an endless loop of her worst memories. And Eric's Ferris wheel kept turning, each revolution dragging him deeper into a horrifying abyss. When the sun rose, the clearing was empty. The carnival was gone, leaving behind only the faint scent of caramel and the echo of distant laughter. A month later, new posters appeared in another town, promising wonders untold. Midnight only. The cycle began anew. The endless hotel. The storm came out of nowhere, a black wall of rain and wind that consumed the highway in seconds. For miles, there had been nothing but flat, empty plains, and now the sky seemed to press down on the earth with relentless fury. Emily, Chris, and their younger sister, Mia, had no choice but to pull over when the rain became too heavy to see even a few feet ahead. "There's no way we're driving in this," Chris muttered, gripping the wheel tightly as thunder rattled the car. "Do you see that?" Mia asked suddenly, her voice trembling. She pointed out the window to a glowing sign barely visible through the sheets of rain. "Looks like a hotel." Emily leaned forward, squinting through the fogged-up windshield. Sure enough, a towering structure loomed in the distance, its neon sign flickering in the storm. "The Haven Inn," it read, in letters that seemed oddly pristine despite their age. "Perfect timing," Chris said, pulling back onto the slick road and heading toward the building. "Let's wait out the storm here." As they approached, the hotel seemed larger than it had at first glance. It stretched endlessly into the darkness, its windows reflecting the brief flashes of lightning. Despite the storm, the parking lot was empty, and no other lights were visible in the surrounding area. "Creepy," Mia whispered, hugging her arms. "Better than sitting in the car all night," Chris replied, stepping out and grabbing their bags. Inside, the lobby was eerily quiet, lit by a chandelier that cast long, distorted shadows on the walls. The air smelled faintly of old wood and something faintly metallic. Behind the front desk stood a man in a perfectly pressed suit. His hair was slicked back, and his smile was unsettlingly wide, his teeth unnaturally white. "Welcome to the Haven Inn," he said in a smooth, velvety voice. "How may I assist you?" "We just need a room for the night," Emily said, glancing nervously at the man. "Of course," he replied, sliding a guest book across the counter. "Please sign in. I'll have your room prepared." As Emily scrawled their names into the book, she noticed the pages were filled with other signatures, but none of them seemed recent. Some were written in faded ink, with dates from decades or even centuries ago. "Your room is ready," the man said, handing Chris a large brass key. "Room 217. Enjoy your stay." The elevator groaned as they ascended to the second floor, its dim light flickering erratically. The hallway stretched impossibly long, lined with doors that all looked the same. Room 217 was at the very end, and when they opened the door, they were met with a surprisingly cozy space: a queen bed, a couch, and a small kitchenette. "Not bad," Chris said, tossing his bag onto the couch. But Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The window looked out into total darkness, as if the storm had erased the world beyond the glass. "Doesn't this place feel weird to you?" Mia asked, her voice low. "It's just old," Chris said dismissively. "Let's get some sleep." But sleep didn't come easily. Emily woke in the middle of the night to the sound of faint knocking. She sat up, her heart pounding. The sound was rhythmic and deliberate, coming from somewhere outside their door. "Chris," she whispered. Her brother stirred on the couch, groggy. "What is it? Do you hear that?" The knocking grew louder, more insistent. Chris stood, walking cautiously to the door. "Probably the wind," he muttered, opening it. The hallway was empty, stretching into the dim, flickering distance. But the knocking continued, now coming from the door directly across the hall. "Don't," Emily hissed, but Chris had already stepped out, his curiosity piqued. He knocked back, and the door creaked open on its own. Inside, the room was a mirror image of theirs, but it was entirely wrong. The furniture was decayed and covered in dust. The bed was unmade, the sheets stained with dark, rust-colored blotches. And on the wall, written in what looked like blood, were the words, "You can never leave." Chris backed out, slamming the door shut. "What the hell?" Before he could finish, the lights in the hallway went out, plunging them into darkness. Emily grabbed Mia and pulled her into the room, slamming their doors shut. "What is happening?" Mia whimpered. "I don't know," Emily said, her voice trembling. The knocking started again, but this time it was everywhere, on the walls, the ceiling, the floor. The sound was deafening, a chaotic rhythm that seemed to come from every direction. Suddenly, the room felt smaller, the walls pressing inward. The door to the bathroom swung open on its own, revealing a dark, gaping void where the mirror should have been. "We need to leave," Emily said, pulling Chris and Mia toward the door. They ran down the hallway, but it seemed to stretch endlessly, the numbers on the doors repeating in an infinite loop. No matter how far they ran, they couldn't reach the elevator. The knocking followed them, growing louder and more frantic. Then the hotel began to change. The walls warped and twisted, the wallpaper peeling away to reveal something pulsing and organic beneath. The chandeliers flickered violently, casting grotesque shadows that seemed to move on their own. Finally, they stumbled into the lobby, breathless and terrified. The man at the desk was still there, his smile wider than ever. "Leaving so soon?" he asked, his voice dripping with mockery. "Let us out," Chris demanded, slamming his fist on the counter. The man chuckled. "But you've only just arrived. Here at the Haven Inn, we ensure our guests are well taken care of." Behind them, the doors they had come through disappeared, replaced by a solid wall. "No!" Mia screamed, pounding her fists against it. Emily turned back to the man. "What do you want from us?" "To make you part of the family," he said, stepping out from behind the desk. As he approached, his form began to change. His face melted into something featureless, his body elongating unnaturally. The room around them dissolved, revealing an endless labyrinth of hallways and doors. From the shadows, figures began to emerge. Other guests, their faces twisted into masks of despair. They reached out with clawed hands, their voices whispering one word over and over. "Stay." Emily grabbed her siblings and ran, their screams swallowed by the infinite corridors. Weeks later, the storm cleared and the highway remained empty. The Haven Inn was gone, leaving no trace of its existence. But somewhere, deep in the twisting halls of the endless hotel, 3 new guests joined the others, their cries echoing into eternity.